The moment Big Ben struck 6:30 p.m. on September 8, 2022, something extraordinary happened within the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace. It wasn't just the silence that fell over the corridors, where footsteps had echoed for 70 years under one sovereign's reign. It wasn't just the sudden stillness in rooms where the same familiar voice had given instructions for 7 decades. It was the sound of history itself, holding its breath. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, between one monarch's final breath and a new king's first official act, the most powerful monarchy in the world transformed completely. Behind those famous black iron gates, away from the crowds and cameras, palace staff who had served one master for their entire careers suddenly found themselves serving another. Portraits that had hung in the same position since 1952 would need to be changed. Letterheads bearing one royal cipher would become obsolete overnight. Even the national anthem would need different words. But this isn't a story about ceremonies or constitutional procedures. This is the untold story of what happened in the shadows of the palace corridors, in the private apartments, in the staff quarters, and in the heart of an institution that had to reinvent itself in real time while the world watched and waited. What happens when the longest reigning monarch in British history takes her final breath? And suddenly everything that seemed permanent becomes uncertain. What happens when tradition meets the shocking reality of change? What happens when the people who knew every preference, every routine, every unspoken rule of one sovereign must instantly adapt to serve another? The answers lie in the extraordinary 48 hours that followed when the British monarchy experienced its most dramatic transformation in living memory, and when the true cost of being royal was measured not in crowns or jewels, but in the human moments that happened when nobody else was watching. The afternoon light was fading through the tall windows of Balmoral Castle when Angela Kelly, the Queen's personal dresser and closest confidante, noticed something different about Her Majesty's breathing. After 30 years of service, Kelly could read the Queen's needs like a well-worn book. She could tell from the way Elizabeth held her teacup whether she was pleased with a meeting, or from the angle of her handbag whether she was ready to leave an event. But this afternoon, something in the rhythm of the Queen's rest told Kelly that this day would be unlike any other in her 3 decades of devoted service. Kelly had been with the Queen longer than most people stay married. She had dressed her for state banquets with world leaders, for Christmas broadcasts watched by millions, and for quiet Sunday services at Crathy Church. She knew exactly how Her Majesty liked her bathwater temperature, which shade of lipstick she preferred for different occasions, and how many sugars she took in her afternoon tea. Kelly wasn't just a servant. She was the keeper of the most intimate details of the most famous woman in the world. As the hours passed, other members of the Queen's immediate household began to arrive at Balmoral. Paul Wybrew, the Queen's page and another of her most trusted companions, had been summoned urgently from London. Wybrew, known affectionately as Tall Paul, due to his imposing height, had been the Queen's shadow for over 20 years. He was the man who carried her handbag, walked her corgis when she couldn't, and was one of the few people on earth who could make the monarch laugh with his gentle humour and unwavering loyalty. The royal family began gathering throughout the afternoon. Prince William drove from Norfolk with the weight of his future responsibilities suddenly feeling much heavier. Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, and Princess Anne rushed to their mother's bedside, each carrying their own complex relationships with the crown and their mother. But it was King Charles, still Prince of Wales in those final hours, who bore the greatest burden. He had waited his entire life to become king, but as he sat beside his mother's bedside, the reality of that moment was nothing like he had imagined during his decades of preparation. Dr. Douglas Glass, the Queen's physician, moved quietly through the castle's corridors, speaking in hushed tones with other medical professionals who had been discreetly summoned. The Queen had always been remarkably healthy, still riding horses into her 90s, and maintaining a work schedule that would exhaust people half her age. But even the strongest constitution couldn't fight time forever. And Dr. Glass knew that the woman who had weathered every storm of the 20th and 21st centuries was facing her final battle. In London, Buckingham Palace had transformed into something resembling a military command centre. Private Secretary Sir Edward Young, the man responsible for managing the Queen's official duties and the complex machinery of the monarchy, was coordinating with government officials, Commonwealth leaders, and palace staff around the world. The carefully rehearsed plans that had been refined for decades, codenamed London Bridge, were being quietly activated. Every phone call was urgent but carefully controlled. Every message was precise but revealed nothing to the outside world. The palace staff who remained in London found themselves in an extraordinary position. They were going about their normal duties, maintaining the grand rooms, preparing for events that might never happen, and answering phones with the same formal protocols they had used for years. Yet everyone could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were living through the final hours of an era that most of them had never known life without. Mrs. Sarah Hamilton, who had managed the Queen's correspondence for 15 years, sat in her small office overlooking the palace gardens, staring at hundreds of letters that had arrived that morning from children, veterans, and ordinary citizens from around the world. Each letter was addressed to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and each would need a response written in the same careful, personal style that had made the Queen's correspondence famous for its warmth and attention to detail. But Mrs. G. Rowe, Hamilton wondered if she would ever write another letter, beginning with, "Her Majesty has asked me to thank you again." The head chef Mark Flanagan continued preparing meals for the skeleton staff remaining in the palace, but his mind was elsewhere. He had cooked for the Queen for over a decade, learning her preferences with the precision of a scientist. She liked her meat well done, her vegetables barely cooked, and her chocolate biscuit cake exactly as her kitchen had made it since she was a child. He knew which dishes she enjoyed for different seasons, which food she avoided, and how she liked her breakfast tray arranged every morning at exactly 8:30 a.m. The thought of cooking for a different monarch with different tastes and different routines felt like preparing to work in an entirely foreign kitchen. As evening approached at Balmoral, the atmosphere grew heavier. The Queen's grandchildren who could make the journey arrived with their own complicated feelings. Some had been close to their grandmother, sharing private jokes and quiet moments away from public duty. Others had felt the weight of royal expectations more heavily, struggling with the demands of being born into a family where personal happiness often came second to public service. Angela Kelly remained at the Queen's side, no longer the formal dresser, but simply a devoted friend watching over someone she had cared for like family. The woman who had selected every outfit for thousands of public appearances, who had ensured that Her Majesty always looked perfect for every photograph and every meeting, was now witnessing the most private moment of the most public life in history. The palace communications team, led by seasoned press officers who had managed everything from royal weddings to family scandals, prepared for the moment when they would need to tell the world that the Elizabethan age had ended. They had practiced this announcement countless times, refining every word, considering every possible reaction, preparing for a moment that would stop normal life across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth realms. In the final hours, as the Scottish Highlands grew dark around Balmoral Castle, the Queen was surrounded by the people who had known her not as a monarch, but as a mother, grandmother, and employer. These were the individuals who had seen her laugh at silly jokes, worry about her family, and work tirelessly at her red boxes of government papers every single day for 70 years. When the moment finally came, it was peaceful. The woman who had dedicated her entire life to service, who had never taken a single day off in 7 decades of duty, who had weathered world wars, political crises, family scandals, and personal grief while maintaining perfect public composure, simply closed her eyes and let go. At 6:30 p.m. on September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died, surrounded by love, and in that instant, everything that had seemed permanent in the British monarchy became history. The Elizabethan age, which had spanned from the post-war recovery through the digital revolution, ended not with drama or ceremony, but with the quiet dignity that had defined her entire reign. Charles was now king, whether he felt ready or not. The staff who had served one sovereign for their entire careers now served another. And in palaces across the United Kingdom, thousands of people who had built their lives around serving the crown suddenly faced the reality that everything they knew about their jobs, their routines, and their purpose was about to change forever. The moment Queen Elizabeth II took her final breath, the transformation of the British monarchy began, and nothing behind those palace walls would ever be quite the same again.
The first phone call came at 6:32 p.m.
Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, spoke 3 words to the duty officer at Buckingham Palace. "London Bridge is down." Those simple words, spoken in the quiet Scottish evening, triggered a chain reaction that would ripple through every corner of the British establishment within minutes. But for those inside the palace walls, the real transformation was just beginning. Within an hour, every major television network in the world had received the carefully worded statement that would change history. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow. 18 words that marked the end of the longest reign in British history and the beginning of an entirely new chapter. But while the world absorbed this seismic news, inside Buckingham Palace, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. Staff members who had been going about their evening routines suddenly found themselves at the center of the most significant constitutional moment in living memory. The palace, which usually settled into quiet efficiency after the day's official business, was buzzing with activity like a hive that had been disturbed. Mrs. Patricia Jenkins, who had been polishing silver in the palace's lower quarters, received word from her supervisor and immediately stopped what she was doing. The silver she had been cleaning, bearing the royal cipher EIR for Elizabeth II Regina, would now become historical artifacts. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of replacing thousands of items throughout the palace with the new king's cipher. But tonight, Patricia simply sat in the silver pantry and cried for the woman she had served faithfully for 12 years, the woman who always remembered to ask about her grandchildren and who had once stopped to help her when she had stumbled with a heavy tray. The palace's telephone operators, led by Chief Operator Margaret Flynn, faced an unprecedented challenge. Within minutes of the announcement, the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from world leaders, government officials, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Margaret had trained her team for busy periods, but nothing had prepared them for this. Every call was historically significant, yet the operators had to maintain their perfect telephone manner while processing their own grief and shock. Margaret herself answered a call from the President of the United States, then immediately after spoke with a crying schoolchild from Wales, who simply wanted to say she was sorry. Each call required the same professional courtesy, the same perfect diction, the same calm demeanor that the palace had maintained for generations. But Margaret noticed that her voice was shaking, and she realized that even the most experienced palace staff was struggling to maintain their composure. In the palace's residential quarters, where some staff lived full-time, the evening took on a surreal quality. Head housemaid Dorothy Wilkinson, who had lived in the palace for 23 years, found herself in the unusual position of comforting other staff members while trying to process her own emotions. Dorothy had cleaned the Queen's private apartments countless times, had seen family photographs that the public never knew existed, and had maintained the personal spaces where the monarch had relaxed away from the public eye. Now Dorothy faced the reality that those familiar rooms would soon belong to King Charles III and Queen Camilla. Everything would need to be changed, from the personal photographs to the furniture arrangement to the daily routines that had remained constant for decades. The Queen had liked her bedroom curtains opened at exactly 7:30 a.m. and closed again at sunset. She had preferred fresh flowers changed every 3 days, and she had always kept a photograph of her late husband Prince Philip on her bedside table. Dorothy wondered what preferences the new king and queen would have, and whether she would be the one to learn and maintain them. The most immediate practical challenge fell to Major Johnny Thompson, the Queen's equerry, and his counterpart who served Prince Charles. The logistics of transforming a Prince of Wales into a king, while managing the practical details of moving a royal household from Scotland to London, required military precision. Major Thompson had coordinated countless royal events, but nothing compared to the complexity of managing the first 24 hours of a new reign while the world watched every detail. Flight plans had to be changed, security details had to be restructured, and protocols that existed only in constitutional theory had to be implemented in real time. Major Thompson found himself coordinating with government officials, military commanders, and palace staff, while also ensuring that the new king had everything he needed during the most difficult and important day of his life. Meanwhile, in the palace kitchens, executive chef Mark Flanagan faced a unique challenge. The new king and queen would be arriving tomorrow, but what should he prepare? King Charles was known for his strong preferences about organic food, his concerns about sustainability, and his specific dietary requirements. This was completely different from Queen Elizabeth's traditional tastes and simple preferences. Chef Flanagan spent the evening researching the new king's favorite dishes and trying to source organic ingredients on incredibly short notice. The palace's master of the household, Vice Admiral Sir Tony Johnston Burt, had perhaps the most complex job of all. He was responsible for managing the entire domestic side of the royal household, from the most senior staff to the newest employees. Now he had to begin the process of transitioning an entire organization from serving one monarch to serving another, while also managing the emotional needs of staff who were grieving the loss of someone they had known personally for years or even decades. Sir Tony called an emergency meeting of senior staff at 10 p.m. that evening. Department heads gathered in a room that had seen countless meetings over the decades, but never one quite like this. The keeper of the privy purse, who managed the royal finances, had to discuss budget implications for the transition. The crown jeweler had to consider which pieces would be used for the coronation that was already being planned. The Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps had to begin coordinating with foreign governments whose representatives would need to present new credentials to the new king. But beyond all the practical details, there was an emotional reality that no protocol manual could address. These people had worked for Queen Elizabeth II, not just for the crown as an abstract institution. They had developed personal relationships with her, had learned her habits and preferences, had taken pride in serving her specifically. Now they had to transfer that loyalty and dedication to someone they knew less well, someone with different preferences and different ways of working. The palace's youngest employees struggled most with this emotional transition. James Morrison, a 24-year-old footman who had been working at the palace for only 2 years, had been thrilled to work for the famous Queen Elizabeth II. He had practiced his bow thousands of times, had learned exactly how to serve tea in the royal manner, and had dreamed of eventually becoming a senior member of the household staff. Now he faced the reality that he would spend his career serving King Charles III instead, and he wasn't even sure if the new king would want to keep him on staff. The yeoman of the cellars, who managed the palace's wine collection, faced an immediate practical problem. The Queen had preferred champagne and gin, while King Charles was known to prefer whiskey and organic wine. The entire contents of the royal cellars might need to be evaluated and potentially changed. It was a small detail in the grand scheme of the transition, but it represented the hundreds of tiny changes that would need to be made throughout the palace. As midnight approached, the palace took on a strange atmosphere. The building was more active than it had been in years, with staff working through the night on preparations for the new reign, but there was also a profound sadness that hung over everything. In quiet moments between urgent tasks, staff members found themselves remembering personal interactions with the Queen, small kindnesses she had shown them, or moments when she had surprised them with her sense of humour or her genuine interest in their lives. The palace's head housekeeper, Mrs. Elizabeth Watts, worked through the night ensuring that the King's apartments would be perfect for his arrival. She had managed royal households for over 30 years, but she had never faced the challenge of transforming living spaces for a completely different monarch overnight. Every detail mattered, from the thread count of the sheets to the arrangement of furniture to the selection of books that would be placed on the bedside table. Watts found herself wondering about the personal touches that would make the new king feel at home. Queen Elizabeth had surrounded herself with familiar objects, family photographs, and mementos from her long reign. What would King Charles want in his private spaces? Would he bring his own belongings, or would he want to maintain some connection to his mother's memory by keeping some of her personal items? By dawn on September 9, 2022, Buckingham Palace had been transformed from the headquarters of Queen Elizabeth II's reign into the nerve centre of King Charles III's monarchy. The building looked the same from the outside, but every person working within those walls knew that they were now part of something completely different. The staff had worked through the night, driven by professionalism, loyalty, and the knowledge that the world would be watching every detail of how smoothly the transition proceeded. But they had also worked through their first night of grief for a woman who had been not just their sovereign, but in many ways their anchor in an uncertain world. As the sun rose over London, the reality of the new reign was just beginning to sink in for everyone who called Buckingham Palace their workplace and, for many, their home. The morning of September 9, 2022, dawned grey and drizzly over London, as if the weather itself was mourning the end of the Elizabethan age. Inside Buckingham Palace, staff members who had worked through the night preparing for their new monarch's arrival were about to face their first real test, serving King Charles III and Queen Camilla in person, in the palace that had been Queen Elizabeth's primary residence for 7 decades. Angela Kelly, who had rushed back from Balmoral on the first available flight, stood in what had been the Queen's private dressing room just 36 hours earlier. The room felt impossibly empty without Her Majesty's presence, but Angela had a job to do. She was now responsible for helping arrange Queen Camilla's wardrobe and understanding her preferences, style, and daily routines. After 30 years of knowing exactly what Queen Elizabeth would want for every occasion, Angela felt like she was starting her career all over again. The differences were immediately apparent and deeply personal. Queen Elizabeth had preferred simple, classic styles and had worn the same trusted brands for decades. She had liked her clothes to fit in a specific way, had preferred certain colors for certain types of events, and had developed a routine for dressing that had remained unchanged for years. Queen Camilla, Angela quickly discovered, had completely different tastes, different concerns about fit and comfort, and different ideas about how royal clothing should look and feel. But the challenge went beyond clothing. Angela had been one of the Queen's closest confidants, someone who saw her in private moments and knew her personality beyond the public image. Now she had to build that same level of trust and understanding with Queen Camilla while also managing her own grief for the woman who had been not just her employer, but her friend. In the palace kitchens, executive chef Mark Flanagan was experiencing his own version of this challenge. King Charles III arrived that morning with specific requests that were entirely different from anything Chef Flanagan had prepared for Queen Elizabeth. The new king wanted organic ingredients sourced from specific suppliers, preferred foods prepared in ways that supported environmental sustainability, and had strong opinions about everything from coffee preparation to the types of bread served at breakfast. Chef Flanagan found himself simultaneously trying to honor the memory of Queen Elizabeth's preferences while learning an entirely new set of royal tastes. The Queen had enjoyed simple, traditional British cuisine prepared with perfect consistency. King Charles wanted innovation, environmental consciousness, and foods that reflected his decades of advocacy for organic farming and sustainable living. It wasn't just a different menu, it was a completely different philosophy about food and its role in royal life. The challenge was most apparent during the King's first official breakfast at Buckingham Palace. The staff had prepared what they thought would be appropriate, but King Charles sent word through his equerry that he would prefer different types of tea, wanted honey instead of sugar, and asked whether the fruit served had been sourced locally and organically. These weren't unreasonable requests, but they represented the beginning of hundreds of small adjustments that would need to be made throughout the palace. Paul Whybrew, who had been Queen Elizabeth's page and one of her most trusted companions, faced perhaps the most difficult transition of all. Tall Paul had been the Queen's shadow for over 20 years, had carried her handbag, had known exactly when she needed assistance and when she preferred to manage on her own, and had been one of the few people who could make her laugh during long, formal events. Now Paul had to learn King Charles's rhythms, preferences, and personality, while also processing his own profound sense of loss. The king was gracious and appreciative of Paul's years of service to his mother, but he was a different person with different needs and different ways of interacting with staff. Paul found himself feeling like he was learning to be a royal servant all over again, despite his decades of experience. The differences extended to the smallest details. Queen Elizabeth had walked at a specific pace, had preferred certain routes through the palace, and had maintained the same daily schedule for so many years that staff could predict her movements almost to the minute. King Charles moved differently, preferred different rooms for different activities, and had his own ideas about how his days should be structured. Every member of the household staff had to adjust their routines accordingly. Sarah Hamilton, who had managed the Queen's correspondence for 15 years, faced a particularly complex challenge. She had developed a deep understanding of Queen Elizabeth's voice and style, had known exactly how the Queen would want to respond to different types of letters, and had been able to write replies that perfectly captured the monarch's tone and personality. Now Mrs. Hamilton had to learn King Charles's communication style while also managing the thousands of condolence letters that were arriving daily from around the world. Each letter deserved a personal response, but Mrs. Hamilton was no longer writing on behalf of Queen Elizabeth II. She was now representing King Charles III, and she had to quickly develop an understanding of how he would want to respond to his subjects' expressions of grief and sympathy. The learning curve was steep and emotionally challenging. The king had different priorities in his correspondence, different causes he wanted to emphasize, and different ways of expressing his thoughts and feelings. Mrs. Hamilton found herself staying late every evening, studying examples of the king's previous letters and speeches, trying to understand his voice well enough to represent him authentically to the thousands of people who were writing to express their condolences and pledge their loyalty to the new reign. Head housemaid Dorothy Wilkinson faced the physical transformation of the royal apartments. Queen Elizabeth's personal belongings had to be carefully packed and moved, while King Charles and Queen Camilla's possessions had to be arranged in the same spaces. It wasn't just a matter of moving furniture. It was about creating a home for people with completely different lifestyles and preferences, while maintaining the dignity and grandeur expected of royal residences. Dorothy discovered that King Charles preferred different lighting, wanted his books arranged in a specific way, and had strong opinions about room temperature and ventilation. Queen Camilla had her own preferences for how she liked her personal spaces arranged, what types of flowers she preferred in her rooms, and how she wanted her daily routine to flow through the palace's living areas. The emotional challenge was just as significant as the practical one. Dorothy had cleaned and maintained Queen Elizabeth's private spaces for over 2 decades. She had taken pride in knowing exactly how Her Majesty liked everything arranged, had felt honored to be trusted with the most intimate aspects of the royal household, and had developed genuine affection for the woman whose private life she had helped maintain. Now Dorothy had to build that same level of trust and understanding with King Charles and Queen Camilla, while also managing her own grief and the profound sense that an era had ended. She found herself fighting back tears while arranging the new king's books or adjusting Queen Camilla's curtains, not because the work was difficult, but because every task reminded her that Queen Elizabeth was truly gone. The palace's telephone operators, led by Chief Operator Margaret Flynn, continued to face unprecedented call volume, but now they also had to adjust their language and protocols. For 70 years, every official call had ended with some variation of on behalf of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Now every conversation had to reflect the reality of King Charles III's reign, and operators had to train themselves to use new phrases and titles while maintaining the same level of professional courtesy that had defined palace communications for generations. Margaret noticed that callers were also struggling with the transition. World leaders who had spoken with Queen Elizabeth for decades were now requesting conversations with King Charles III. Citizens who had always addressed their letters to Her Majesty were uncertain about proper protocols for communicating with the new king. Everyone was learning together, but the palace staff had to project confidence and continuity even while they were figuring things out themselves. Major Johnny Thompson, the Queen's former equerry, worked closely with King Charles's staff to coordinate the complex logistics of royal life under new management. The challenge went beyond scheduling. It involved understanding how King Charles preferred to work, what types of briefings he wanted before events, and how he liked to interact with staff and officials during his daily duties. Major Thompson discovered that King Charles had different ideas about punctuality, preferred different types of transportation for different events, and wanted more detailed information about the environmental impact of royal activities. These weren't difficult requests to accommodate, but they required a complete rethinking of how royal events were planned and executed. The most poignant moments came during quiet times, when staff members found themselves automatically preparing things the way Queen Elizabeth had liked them, only to realize that those preferences no longer mattered. Chef Flanagan caught himself preparing the Queen's favorite afternoon tea, before remembering that King Charles preferred different biscuits and different types of tea. Angela Kelly found herself reaching for clothing styles that Queen Elizabeth would have loved, then having to remind herself that Queen Camilla had her own distinctive preferences. These small moments of muscle memory and automatic behavior reminded everyone in the palace that they were still grieving while also trying to serve their new monarchs with the same dedication and professionalism they had shown Queen Elizabeth. It was emotionally exhausting work that required them to be simultaneously backward-looking in their grief and forward-looking in their service. As the first week of King Charles III's reign concluded, the staff of Buckingham Palace were beginning to find their rhythm in serving their new monarchs. They were learning that King Charles and Queen Camilla brought their own warmth, their own sense of humor, and their own ways of showing appreciation for the dedicated service of the palace staff. But they were also learning that change, even positive change, comes with a cost. The familiarity and comfort of serving Queen Elizabeth for decades had been replaced by the uncertainty and challenge of learning to serve new masters. The staff who remained were committed to making the transition successful, but they would carry their memories of Queen Elizabeth's reign forever, and those memories would always be part of how they understood their role in the continuing story of the British monarchy. The palace walls had witnessed the end of one era and the beginning of another, and everyone who lived and worked within those walls had been changed by the experience of serving during this historic transition.